Chapter 1. The Impossible Disappearance. It was on one of those crisp March mornings, when the fog hung low over the city like a mourner's veil, that I first learned of the mystery that would soon transport Holmes and myself from the hearth of Baker Street to the damp cobblestone lanes of Hampshire. The telegram that arrived at our quarters bore no signature, but the urgency in its phrasing was unmistakable. Urgent stop vanishing of guest under impossible circumstances. Stop Bluebell Inn, Hampshire. Stop police baffled. Stop request Holmes assistance. Stop Holmes was reclining in his armchair, legs folded beneath him like a cat at rest, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The fire crackled beside us, and a half-smoked pipe lay cooling in the ashtray. I had barely finished reading aloud, when his eyes, those sharp grey orbs that missed nothing, lit with sudden interest. "A vanishing, Watson," he murmured, "a classic vanishing. And at an inn, no less. Quaint, romantic, possibly absurd, and certainly curious." I examined the telegram again. No signature, Holmes. Could be a hoax. He tapped the arm of his chair thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but we have learned, my dear Watson, that when a message lacks a name but insists upon our presence, it is rarely frivolous. The anonymity suggests embarrassment or danger, or both." I had grown used to such pronouncements. Within the hour, Holmes had wired Lestrade at Scotland Yard, requested a special compartment on the next train to Winchester, and dispatched Mrs. Hudson to pack his peculiar assortment of travel gear, including, curiously, a length of twine and a German pocket barometer. By 3 that afternoon, we were rattling south through the English countryside, Holmes silent and contemplative, his gaze fixed out the window while the hills rolled by. It was not until we neared our destination that he spoke again. "You see, Watson, there is a fundamental question that has not been asked." "Oh?" "If someone vanishes from an inn, the first question is not, where did they go, but rather, how could they have gone at all? The inn is a bounded environment. If the structure is sound and the exits are few, then disappearance implies illusion, and illusion implies intent." "Or madness," I offered. He gave a slight nod. "Possibly, but madness does not often take the trouble to lock doors behind itself." It was nearing dusk when we arrived at the village of Elcombe, a quiet Hampshire hamlet best known, as the porter informed us, for little more than its moss-covered gravestones and a vanished canal. The Bluebell Inn stood near the western edge, a 2-story Tudor structure, with bowed windows and a swinging sign that bore its name in faded blue paint. The landlord, a man named Crispin Toller, met us at the threshold. He was a broad, red-cheeked fellow, whose hands trembled slightly as he ushered us in. His expression was a mixture of dread and relief, one I had often seen when Holmes entered a scene of confusion. "You're Mr. Holmes?" he asked, eyeing Holmes's thin frame and travel-stained coat with cautious hope. "And Dr. Watson?" Holmes inclined his head. "You sent the telegram?" Toller's eyes darted about the room. I did, sir. The constable's as confused as the rest of us. It's Miss Hartwood, Marjorie Hartwood. Came in 3 nights ago, vanished yesterday morning. Room locked from the inside, windows bolted, no trace, no sound, no clue. She's simply gone." "And the police? They've turned the place upside down, searched the roof, even checked the chimney. Nothing. They say she ran off, but how, I ask you? No one saw her leave. No one could have." Holmes looked around the inn's narrow foyer, then slowly climbed the stairs without asking permission. Toller hurried after him. She was in the northeast room, corner chamber, best light in the house. We followed into a modest but well-appointed room, a writing desk with ink still fresh in the well, a closed travel case atop a trunk, and a single bed with the sheets undisturbed. The sole window overlooked a weedy garden wall, and I noted, as Holmes did, the heavy internal latch drawn firmly across it. "She was here alone?" Holmes asked, kneeling to inspect the floorboards. "Yes." "A writer," she said, "researching for a novel, something about historical murders. Paid in advance, kept to herself mostly. Had a visitor the day before she disappeared. A gentleman." "What gentleman?" Toller fidgeted. "Didn't give a name. Sharp-dressed, pale, with a black umbrella. Only stayed 10 minutes. Holmes tapped at the floor with his knuckles, then turned abruptly to the fireplace. He reached in and withdrew a charred piece of ribbon. "Curious," he said softly. "This was burned deliberately, but only partially. And see here, Watson, the ashpan is empty. Emptied after? Possibly, or it was never used for ash at all." He next examined the travel case, which contained 2 dresses, a small mirror, and a locked diary. Holmes weighed it in his hand and shook it once. "Light," he said, "noticeably so." I peered at the window again. "There's no way down, not unless she jumped, and even then—" "She did not jump," Holmes said firmly. "Watson, do you detect the faint odour? Camphor. Close, something adjacent. Ether, perhaps, though diluted." Holmes straightened, his eyes glittering. "We shall dine, Mr. Toller, and I shall ask you for a complete list of your guests from the past 4 nights. Every name, room number, and point of origin. And I trust you won't mind if I take a plaster. Impression of your cellar door." "My cellar door?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Let us say that in cases of disappearance, the entrances are rarely where we expect them to be, and neither are the exits." As we descended to supper, I glanced back at the empty room with a creeping chill at my spine. The air within still held her perfume, and yet Marjorie Hartwood was gone, as if she had stepped from reality into myth, and only Holmes, I knew, would ever find the thread that led back. Chapter 2. A Study in Ether and Silence. The dining room of the Bluebell Inn was a narrow chamber with low beams and a faint scent of damp pinewood. A fire struggled against the chill in the hearth, and 2 elderly guests murmured quietly over soup at a table by the window. Holmes and I sat at a corner table with Mr. Toller, who had taken it upon himself to explain every inch of the affair, in a low, strained voice. "She was a quiet sort, Miss Hartwood," he began, folding and refolding his napkin. "Hardly left the room except for meals. Said she was researching old court cases. Kept a large ledger in her satchel, always scribbling into it. She had this way of listening, like she was always gathering words for later." "Did she mention anyone by name?" Holmes asked without looking up from his plate. "An employer? A relative? No, sir. Only that she'd be staying a week and preferred solitude." Holmes cut into the ham with deliberate care. "You said she had a visitor?" Toller nodded. "Evening before she vanished. Tall, clean-shaven man. Dressed like a banker. Pressed coat, gloves. Didn't take off his hat. They spoke in her room for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he left in a hired trap bound for Alresford." no name given. Holmes glanced at me briefly, then returned to his meal. And you allowed this stranger up to a lady's private quarters without question? Tuller flushed. She gave permission, sir. Came down to the door herself. Ah! Holmes tapped the edge of his glass thoughtfully. Describe her mood when she returned from the meeting. Toller hesitated, distracted, pale. She left half her supper untouched, seemed to forget where she was. Holmes wiped his mouth with a napkin and rose. Mr. Toller, after we've eaten, you will kindly show me the guest registry and the cellar entrance. Also, if there are any deliveries recorded the morning Miss Hartwood vanished, I would like to examine those logs. Toller blinked. You think she was taken out in a crate? Holmes smiled faintly. When an answer seems absurd, Mr. Toller, I ask myself, absurd to whom? After the meal, Holmes led the way into a narrow corridor behind the kitchen. There, behind a linen rack, stood a stout wooden door with an iron handle leading down into the cellar. Toller fetched a lantern, and we descended a short flight of stone steps into a chilly darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, old coal, and something else, something sharper. Holmes paused halfway down the steps, nose twitching. Ether again, he murmured. The cellar was orderly, its floor swept clean, and wine bottles stacked neatly along the east wall. Crates of dried goods lined one side, and a pile of firewood sat beneath a high narrow slit of a window. Holmes walked the perimeter slowly, pausing at the window. This faces the rear courtyard. Yes, but it's no more than a foot wide, Toller said. You couldn't get a dog through it. Holmes crouched, brushing the dust near the firewood with his fingers. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small vial which he held beneath his nose. After a few moments he sprinkled a light powder near the woodpile. What is that? I asked. Chalk dust mixed with paraffin. Harmless, but it clings to ether residue. He stood. No significant traces here. Let us move on. Back upstairs, Toller produced the guest book and laid it on the front desk. Holmes flipped through the pages, his eyes darting quickly from name to name. Let's see. A Mr. and Mrs. Halbridge arrived from Dover. A Mr. Thomas Greeley, solicitor from Cheltenham. A Reverend Ponsby. And finally, Miss Marjorie Hartwood. 2 days after the others. No aliases, no alterations. He paused at one name. Tell me, Mr. Toller, this Reverend Ponsby, did you observe his habits? Kept mostly to himself. Odd fellow. Writes sermons with a quill pen. Said he'd taken a vow of silence for Lent. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. A vow of silence. How very timely! He turned to me. Watson, tomorrow we shall pay a visit to the surrounding grounds. Suspect this inn is not as sealed as it appears. That night, sleep came fitfully. I lay awake in the creaky guest room, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the building settling into darkness. The image of Miss Hartwood's empty room haunted me. The untouched bed, the scent of her perfume still lingering, the half-burnt ribbon. Holmes, ever tireless, paced the corridor outside my door once or twice in the early hours, his footsteps pausing at intervals as though he were listening for something. The next morning dawned wet and grey. Holmes was already dressed and sipping tea when I descended. He handed me a folded sheet of paper. Miss Hartwood's diary, unlocked. I picked it last night, read the final entry. I did so, frowning. March 15th. He has found me. I cannot believe it, after so long. He was polite, but it was in his eyes. The same look as before. I should leave now, but something tells me I won't be allowed. If I disappear, let this book prove I did not go willingly. A chill crept over me. Holmes rose. Pack your satchel, Watson. We have a garden to examine, and perhaps a silent clergyman to disturb. But Holmes, who is he? Holmes paused at the door, his eyes glittering. That, my dear Watson, is the first thread in the fabric, and if I tug it carefully, the whole tapestry may yet come undone. Chapter 3. The Garden Wall and the Silent Clergyman. The garden behind the Bluebell Inn was a patchwork of weeds, flagstone paths, and low hedgerows that had not known proper trimming in months. Moss had overtaken the stone borders, and a tangle of bramble half concealed the eastern corner wall. It was here that Holmes, magnifying glass in hand and eyes sharp with purpose, stooped to examine the soil with that curious reverence he often reserved for footprints, cigar ash, or ancient manuscripts. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, brushing away some leaves with a gloved hand. "These indentations, faint but recent. The heel prints are shallow, but the right one presses deeper. Someone favouring a leg, or perhaps carrying a burden." I peered at the marks. "You believe someone came this way during the night, or very early morning. Note the overlay of dew. The grass is broken, not merely bent, and see here." He pointed toward the wall, where a section of mortar near the base appeared damp. "This discoloration is recent, moisture seeping through brickwork, but only in this one patch. A hidden passage? Too narrow, but perhaps an aperture. Let us not be hasty in assigning function." We spent nearly 20 minutes inspecting the length of the wall, Holmes prodding loose stones and tapping for hollows. Finally, he paused beneath a low-hanging ash tree and pulled a length of linen string from his pocket. With it, he measured the height from the top of a bootmark to a crooked wooden trellis leaning against the wall. No ordinary gardener left. "These," he said. "Someone made a deliberate ascent." The trellis was positioned precisely beneath this ash bough. "Now, note the broken twigs above." I followed his gaze. Indeed, several branches showed fresh breaks, as though someone had pulled themselves upward. "They escaped this way," I said, the conclusion dawning on me. "Out the window, across the garden, over the wall." Holmes shook his head. "Not Miss Hartwood. The weight distribution is all wrong. A man passed this way, Watson. Taller, heavier, and judging by the faint smear of something chalky near the top stone, he had ether on his gloves. This," he said, lifting a pale scrap of fabric caught on a thorn, "may have been hers, torn perhaps as she was carried." I felt my stomach twist. "Then she was abducted." Holmes tucked the fabric away. "Let us say she did not vanish of her own accord." We returned to the inn, where Mr. Toller informed us that the Reverend Ponsby had just taken tea in the reading room. Holmes wasted no time. He strode in without knocking. The Reverend was a lanky, ascetic man, dressed in worn clerical garb and seated beside a chessboard on which no pieces had moved. His eyes, pale blue and deeply set, turned slowly to regard us. He did not speak. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Good morning, Reverend. May we sit?" There was no objection. Ponsonby gestured faintly to the opposite chairs and folded his hands. Holmes studied him for a long moment. "It's a curious vow you've taken, Reverend. Silence. For Lent, may I ask how many years you've practised this?" Ponsonby lifted a small slate from beside the chair and scribbled a reply in neat script. 3 years. A personal discipline. Holmes smiled. "And yet you received a visitor 2 nights ago, did you not?" Ponsonby looked puzzled. Holmes clarified. "A woman, tall, with auburn hair, Miss Hartwood." Ponsonby hesitated. He wrote, "We passed briefly in the corridor. I did not speak. She did not speak to me." Holmes leaned back. "Your handwriting is precise, though the chalk residue on your sleeve suggests you have used the slate more frequently than you claim." The clergyman's fingers twitched. He began to write again, but paused, wiped the slate clean, and instead retrieved a small pocketbook from his coat. From within, he produced a folded sheet of paper and handed it silently to Holmes. It was a letter, short and unsigned, but unmistakably Marjorie Hartwood's handwriting, as Holmes quickly confirmed by comparing it to the diary. "I do not expect you to break your vow, but I must know if you remember what happened in Gloucester. If you remember me, I thought I had outrun the shadows, but he has found me again. I fear it may be too late." M.H. Holmes read the letter twice. "So she did speak to you, Reverend, if not aloud, then in writing." Ponsonby's face was unreadable. He took the letter back and wrote on his slate. I never replied. I could not. I whispered to Holmes, "What happened in Gloucester?" But he waved the question away. A thread for later. For now, one more matter. Where were you between the hours of 6 and 8, the morning Miss Hartwood vanished? The Reverend did not hesitate. Prayers. Then walk along the stream. Holmes nodded. Alone? A pause. Yes. Holmes stood. Thank you, Reverend. We may speak again soon. As we exited the room, I asked, Do you trust him? Holmes rubbed his temple. No more than I distrust him. The vow of silence is a clever mask, but whether it hides guilt or shame, we must yet discover. What matters more is that our missing woman feared a figure from her past, a man who found her here. And the visitor with the umbrella? Possibly, but I suspect we must now widen our lens. This is no simple matter of a jealous suitor or a jilted rival, Watson. There is an older wound beneath this crime, one reopened in that quiet room, and someone has gone to great lengths to keep it buried. We stepped out into the late morning drizzle, the inn's crooked chimney sending up lazy wisps of smoke. Somewhere, beyond the grey hedgerows and muddy fields, lay the key to Marjorie Hartwood's vanishing, and Holmes, as always, had already begun to see the locks taking shape. Chapter 4. Guests with Shadows Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon studying the inn's upper floor, drifting from hallway to stairwell with the quiet intensity of a man deciphering an invisible script. He paused often, running his hand along banisters, crouching to examine floorboards, even tapping gently against the thin plaster walls. Mr. Toller, trailing him anxiously, seemed unsure whether to offer assistance or stay out of the way. "Your guests," Holmes said finally. "How well do you know them?" Toller scratched the back of his neck. "Well enough to take their coin. Most are passing through. Mr. Greeley's here for legal work, land grants or some such. The Halbridges are holidaying on a doctor's advice. And the Reverend, well, you've seen for yourself." "Have they spoken of Miss Hartwood?" "Only Greeley asked after her the day she vanished. He said he'd meant to discuss some local records with her, thinking she was a historian." Holmes nodded slowly. "I should like to speak with them all, separately." That evening, Toller arranged a polite excuse, a fire in the lounge, free tea, and a chessboard laid invitingly beneath the window, to allow Holmes and me to engage the other guests without raising suspicion. Holmes began with Mr. Thomas Greeley, who entered with the composed stiffness of a man used to billing his time by the quarter hour. He was a tidy fellow in his 40s, with pale parchment-like skin, thinning hair, and a voice that rang of the "court's clear, confident but always measured, Miss Hartwood," he said, sipping his tea. "I encountered her only twice in the lounge. Once she asked if I knew where the local parish kept its burial records. I told her they were likely with the vicar of St. Elwyn's, a very precise young woman. Rather intense, actually." "You didn't know her professionally?" Holmes asked. "Not at all. I presumed she was a freelance researcher or novelist. Frankly, I was surprised someone of her intellect would stay at such a rustic establishment. Not that I fault the inn, of course," he added quickly. "You mentioned to Mr. Toller that you had hoped to speak with her the day she vanished." Greeley looked momentarily uneasy. "Yes, I had a file concerning the sale of an old estate, the Addleton property, abandoned since the 1860s. I had reason to believe she was researching related subjects. Nothing more." "May we see the file?" Holmes asked. Greeley pursed his lips. "If you believe it relevant." "We do." With a slight bow, the solicitor returned to his room. Holmes said nothing as we waited. When Greeley reappeared, he held a worn manila folder containing brittle deeds and a folded diagram of an estate layout, stables, manor, and a marked well in the centre. Holmes examined it briefly. "Addleton, you said?" "Yes. It was abandoned after a scandal. A judge was murdered there, by his ward, if local stories are to be believed." Holmes arched a brow. "You find that sort of legend useful in your business?" "Useful?" Greeley gave a dry smile. "Only when it drives the price down." Holmes took the file and promised its return. When Greeley left, Holmes turned to me. "What do you make of him, Watson?" "Direct, educated, but evasive when cornered." "Precisely. He knows more about Miss Hartwood than he admits, but he is not our villain. He's protective of information, not people." Our next conversation was with the Halbridges, a plump, middle-aged couple with ruddy faces and a tendency to speak over one another. Mrs. Halbridge, a woman with a fondness for shawls and idle chatter, proved far more enlightening than her husband. "Oh, the poor dear!" she exclaimed when Holmes inquired about Miss Hartwood. "Such a lovely young woman, always scribbling in that notebook. We passed her in the hall several times, always polite, though distant." "Did she ever mention being in distress?" Holmes asked. "Not directly," Mrs. Halbridge said, lowering her voice, "but once, I believe it was 2 nights before she vanished, I heard her speaking sharply in her room. Through the door, mind you." A man's voice answered, low and quite firm. She told him, and I quote, "I won't be blackmailed." Again, Holmes froze. "You're certain of the words?" "Absolutely." I was just returning from the washroom. I paused, thinking it was an argument between lovers, but then I heard a thump. A chair, perhaps. Then silence. Mr. Halbridge stirred. "I told you not to eavesdrop, Marian." "I wasn't eavesdropping, Walter. I was returning from the washroom." Holmes interjected gently. "Did you see the man?" Mrs. Halbridge frowned. "No, but I did glimpse someone tall and pale leaving the corridor later that night. Could have been that silent reverend. He gives me the shivers." Holmes smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mrs. Halbridge. You've been most helpful." We retired to our own chamber as the inn quieted. Holmes paced. The Addleton estate plans spread out on the writing desk beside the diary and the burned ribbon from the fireplace. His eyes flicked from paper to paper with increasing intensity. "Watson," he said at length, "we must visit Addleton. Greeley's interest in the property is not coincidental, nor is Miss Hartwood's research. She uncovered something, perhaps from that murder case, and it brought danger to her door." "The line in her diary," I said, "about being found. Do you think someone connected to the Addleton scandal has returned to silence her?" "Quite likely. The estate is our next path forward. But first," he held up the burned ribbon, "this, Watson, is not from a dress. It is too coarse. It's a ceremonial band of some kind, and it was only half burnt." "Meaning?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Meaning someone started to destroy it, then changed their mind, or was interrupted. I believe we are being watched, even now." He closed the shutters softly, and for the first time since our arrival at the Bluebell Inn, I felt the unease shift from intellectual curiosity to something colder, something real. The Bluebell Inn harboured more than secrets. It harboured someone who had already made one woman vanish. Chapter 5. The Man in the Photograph. The following morning brought little sunlight. A fine mist clung to the hedges, and the chill in the air had crept into the bones of the inn. Holmes was already at the writing desk when I awoke, hunched in his chair like a gargoyle over the documents we had collected. Marjorie Hartwood's final diary entries, the fragment of ceremonial ribbon, the Addleton estate map, and the solicitor's deed folder. He had placed the latter at the centre, weighting its corners with a spoon, a pocket-knife, and a candle stub. "You see the layout," he said, tapping the diagram with his finger. I leaned in beside him. A manor house, stables, and a walled garden, and this, marked in red, is the well. "Precisely," Holmes said. "It was sealed after the murder in 1868, officially condemned. But look at the dimensions, 12 feet wide and deep, very deep." I shivered. "You believe that's where she was taken?" "I believe," he said quietly. "It is where she feared she might be buried." Before I could respond, a light knock came at the door. Mr. Tuller entered with an envelope in hand, his brow furrowed. "This just came by post, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Marked urgent." Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of folded vellum and a faded photograph. I saw at once that it was old, sepia-tinged, the edges curled. It showed a group of people standing in front of a marble building, 7 in all. At the centre stood a tall, austere man in clerical robes, flanked by what appeared to be parishioners and officials. And there, to the right, barely more than a girl, was a younger version of Marjorie Hartwood. Holmes studied it for a long moment before flipping the image over. The back bore a faint handwritten note. St. Miriam's Asylum, Gloucester. Summer of 1897. Toller looked at us nervously. "Asylum, sir," Holmes murmured. "Marjorie was institutionalized, or perhaps employed there. Either way, someone knows what she witnessed, and they are watching." I glanced again at the photograph. "Is that the Reverend Ponsonby?" Holmes gave a grim nod. "Clean-shaven then, but yes. And that," he said, pointing to the man in clerical robes, "is the man Marjorie feared. Her letter implied she had known him, and that he had returned." Holmes stood. "Pack your satchel, Watson. We're going to Addleton. The inn has shown us all it can. Now we must follow the echo." Toller offered to secure a trap for the journey. It was a muddy road, he warned us, and rarely travelled. Few visited. The Addleton ruins since the manor's collapse. The scandal of the judge's murder had become village legend, a tale mothers told to keep children from wandering too far. The ride was uneventful, but damp. The countryside blurred behind sheets of drizzle, and by the time we arrived at the overgrown path to Addleton Estate, the mist had deepened, turning the trees into hulking silhouettes. The trap driver refused to wait and turned back with haste once we had disembarked. The path was more ruin than road, flanked by crumbling dry stone walls and brambles that clawed at our trousers. Holmes led the way with single-minded intensity, the estate map tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the landscape with restless energy. At last we reached the gates. The Addleton Manor had once been grand. That much was evident. Now it stood partially collapsed, ivy clinging to its facade, one wing entirely caved in. The shutters hung at broken angles, and pigeons scattered from the gables as we approached. The air here was different, quieter somehow, as though the earth itself had gone still. We passed through a broken side door into what had once been a parlour. Rain had gotten into the beams. The floor creaked underfoot. Holmes paused only briefly to inspect a scorched fireplace before heading through a doorway to the rear. The garden, too, had gone to rot. Thorn bushes bloomed unchecked. Statues lay overturned. And in the centre, obscured by moss and weeds, was the old well. Its stone lip was intact, but the iron cap had rusted through in places. Holmes approached cautiously, brushing aside vines. "This was no decorative well, Watson. Look at the pulley, reinforced iron. It was meant to draw weight." I peered over the edge and saw only darkness. Holmes removed a small silver mirror from his coat and angled it down the shaft. Then, using a length of twine, he lowered a match secured in a metal clip. It took nearly 10 seconds for the flame to vanish below. "Deep," he said, "at least 40 feet, and yet, do you smell that?" I did. Something sharp and sterile, faint but unmistakable. "Ether," I whispered. He nodded, lingering. Weeks old, perhaps, but still here. The place was used recently. He circled the well once more, then stopped at a patch of churned soil. Holmes dropped to one knee and traced a faint pattern in the mud. Wheel marks. Narrow, not from a cart, but something smaller, like a barrow or chair. A heavy load moved toward the well, not away. And the load was Marjorie? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stood slowly, dusted his knees, and surveyed the grounds. We must return before dark. But this, he pointed to the well, is where she vanished from the world. Whether alive or otherwise, she passed through this circle of stone. The wind picked up as we left Addleton, and I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Somewhere, in that ruinous place, the past still lingered, waiting, as if it had not finished speaking. Holmes walked in silence beside me, the photograph tucked into his coat, his jaw set like stone. Whatever he had seen in that asylum picture, it had deepened the stakes of the case beyond murder or disappearance. It had touched a history he had not yet spoken aloud. And I, walking behind him through the grey wet dusk, knew with certainty we were no longer chasing a missing woman. We were chasing a secret that someone had killed to keep buried. Chapter 6. Threads in the Smoke. Our return to the Bluebell Inn was greeted not with calm, but with whispers. As Holmes and I stepped through the rain-darkened door, we found the sitting-room in quiet uproar. Mrs. Halbridge stood near the hearth, wringing her shawl in agitation, while Mr. Toller conferred with the village constable, a lean, moustached man who glanced up sharply at our entrance. "Toller," Holmes said evenly, removing his gloves. "What has happened?" The innkeeper gestured toward the constable. Constable Rigby was called. A guest's belongings were ransacked during the day. The Reverend Ponsby's trunk. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Ransacked, you say? And when did the Reverend report?" "It?" Mrs. Halbridge cut in. "He didn't. He vanished this afternoon. Packed a bag and left. Just walked off toward the train station without a word to anyone." Holmes's gaze sharpened. Without a word? The man who had vowed silence. "Rigby," spoke up now, his tone clipped. "We've wired the station master. No ticket was purchased in Ponsby's name. Might be using another identity. Or he might have vanished like the girl." Holmes said nothing. He turned to Toller. "The Reverend's trunk. May I?" Toller hesitated. "It's still in his room, unlocked, after the search." Holmes didn't wait for permission. We followed him up the stairs, where he moved swiftly into the Reverend's chamber. The air was thick with old incense and the faint residue of ink. The trunk sat open by the bed. Clothing had been tossed aside, drawers left half pulled. Holmes knelt beside the trunk and began sorting its contents with gloved fingers. Robes, a slim Bible, a small tin of chalk, a quill, and several pages of scripture, carefully copied. Then something curious. He lifted a folded cream-coloured card from beneath a pile of clothes. It bore a wax seal, a faded crest of a tree with one broken branch. Inside, written in a flowing clerical hand, were 5 words: "Forgive, but do not forget." There was no signature. Holmes passed it to me. An odd message for a man of God. In the broken branch, a symbol of schism, something or someone cast out. He returned to the trunk. From a secret pocket in the trunk's lining, Holmes drew out a smaller envelope, sealed in red wax. Inside was a photograph, this one much newer than the asylum image, but equally haunting. It showed Marjorie Hartwood once more. She stood near a gravestone, her eyes looking not at the camera, but off into the middle distance. Her expression was neither fearful nor sad, but resolute. In the background was a barely visible chapel spire, unfamiliar to me, but not, it seemed, to Holmes. He traced the spire with his finger. "This is the chapel at Hatherden, 20 miles south of here. That was her final destination before she came to the Bluebell. What would a woman trying to hide want from a chapel?" Holmes stood. "Sanctuary, Watson, or absolution?" The constable entered the room behind us, arms folded. "You suspect this Ponsonby fellow?" "I suspect he was not who he claimed," Holmes replied without turning. "This room reeks of staged escape. The missing man wishes to be missed, but not pursued. His flight was calculated." Rigby nodded. "We'll put out a bulletin." "No," Holmes said sharply. "Let him run. The more confident he feels, the more likely he will return to his master." "His master?" Holmes turned now, eyes blazing. "This is no longer a case of personal jealousy or blackmail. Miss Hartwood was entangled in something older, something that began at that asylum and found its echo in the Addleton grounds. A group, Watson, a brotherhood perhaps, or something cloaked in religious trappings. But make no mistake, it is power they guard, not salvation." Back downstairs, the lounge was empty save for Mr. Greeley, who sat reading near the fire, his legs crossed with casual precision. Holmes approached. "A moment, Mr. Greeley." The solicitor closed his book. "Certainly." Holmes showed him the photograph from the trunk. "Recognize the location?" Greeley studied it carefully. "Yes, that's the chapel of St. Emmeran. I handled its insurance 2 years ago after a fire damaged the sacristy." "And the woman?" He looked again. "No, I don't believe I've seen her. Why?" "She stood at that grave within weeks of arriving at the Bluebell Inn. We believe she went there seeking someone." Greeley frowned. "If this is connected to the Addleton property, I'm afraid I can't help further. But I'll give you the name of the current caretaker. He's a trustworthy man, Mr. Lyon, retired schoolteacher." Holmes jotted the name. "Thank you." Outside, the fog was thickening again. Holmes stood beneath the crooked sign of the inn, his coat collar raised, hands deep in his pockets. "There is a presence behind this, Watson," he said quietly. "Not a person, but a system. You saw the crest on that card, a tree with a broken branch. Marjorie Hartwood knew what it meant. The Reverend did too. A secret society, perhaps, or a splinter from a former one. A cult, a cloistered sect, who can say? But their symbol reappears. On the ribbon, in the letter, on the seal. This isn't murder alone. It's a cleansing." I stiffened. "You mean they believe they are ridding themselves of her?" She threatened their foundation, their buried past. She had knowledge they cannot afford to be made public. I looked up at him. "Do you still believe she's alive?" He paused. "Yes," he said, "because they've gone to great lengths to silence her. If they had succeeded, there would be no need for such misdirection." He turned back to the door. "Tomorrow we ride to Hatherden. If she left a message, it will be at St. Emmeran's, and if the man she feared came from there, we must meet him." I nodded, but a gnawing dread was settling at the base of my spine. We had begun with a woman who vanished from a locked room. Now we were walking into a cathedral of shadows, where names were forgotten and secrets were kept in stone. Chapter 7. The Chapel Beneath the Fog. The road to Hatherden was little more than a meandering trail, choked by wet leaves and narrowed by low stone walls that leaned like weary sentinels. We set out at first light, the fog clinging to our shoulders like a second coat. Holmes rode beside the driver in silence, eyes scanning the shifting treetops and distant pastures, while I jotted observations in my notebook. Though the further we travelled, the more I found myself merely watching Holmes. He was in his most peculiar state, not agitated, not withdrawn, but sharpened, as if something unseen pressed urgently against the edges of his mind. "You believe we will find something at the chapel?" I said as we passed a moss-covered milestone. "I know it," Holmes replied without looking. "St. Emmeren's appears, repeatedly in the fragments left behind. The photograph, the ribbon, even the crest on the Reverend's card resembles a faded carving I recall seeing there, years ago, on a different case. A broken tree. Yes, a common symbol in heraldry for something deliberately severed, an heir disinherited, a brotherhood fractured, a truth concealed." By the time the chapel's steeple came into view, the fog had thickened so greatly that its outline shimmered like a mirage. St. Emmeren's stood at the top of a knoll, modest and half swallowed by ivy. A cemetery, long overgrown, lapped at its edges like dark water around a rock. The chapel doors were closed but not locked. Inside it was cold and quiet, the stale scent of wax and dust mixing with damp stone. Long disused pews crouched beneath beams that creaked with the faintest breeze. Light filtered through high-coloured glass, casting fractured blues and greens across the nave, and at the far end a man waited. He stood motionless near the altar, a tall, clean-shaven figure in a dark waistcoat with silver buttons. His hands were folded before him, and his expression, calm, composed, was too studied to be genuine. This, I knew at once, was Mr. Lyon. "Mr. Lyon?" Holmes asked. The man gave a slight nod. "I am he." Holmes stepped forward slowly. "We are investigating the disappearance of a woman named Marjorie Hartwood. She visited this chapel within the last month." "She did," Lyon said. "She stood before that grave." He pointed to a worn headstone near the rear window. We followed his gaze. The name upon it was barely legible beneath lichen, but the inscription remained intact. Edwin Altham born, 1853, died 1884. He bore the mark and paid the price. Holmes knelt beside the stone. "Altham. The name appears nowhere in the Addleton case files." "He was erased," Lyon said, his voice flat, "by his own brotherhood." Holmes looked up sharply. "The Brotherhood of St. Miriam?" Lyon did not flinch. "So she told you." "She left signs for us to follow. The ribbon, the seal, the photograph." Lyon sighed and sat heavily on a bench. "Then you already know what this is?" "Partly," Holmes said. "I know that she was a witness to something at St. Miriam's Asylum, something your group tried to conceal." Lyon's eyes glittered. "More than conceal. We buried it," I interjected now. "You speak as though it were a body." He turned to me. "In a manner of speaking, Doctor, Edwin Altham was a reformer. He tried to bring light into the order, to expose the punishments inflicted in the name of purity. Isolation chambers, ether sedation, forced vows. When he threatened to contact the bishop, they declared him unstable. Marjorie Hartwood was his nurse. She smuggled out his journals before they came for him. Holmes said. She fled, changed names, burned records. And kept one copy, Lyon added, a ledger hidden away. She told me when she visited, she feared someone had found her. She believed the order had reformed, quietly, privately, and now sought to erase the past fully. Who was the man she feared? Holmes asked. Lyon hesitated. I don't know his name now. He has taken others. But once, long ago, he was called Father Caleb. Holmes stood slowly, face hardening. I know that name. So does the church, but you won't find it in any official list. He was expunged after the inquest into the deaths at St. Miriam's in 1897. But he was never tried, never seen again. Until now, I murmured. Holmes turned to Lyon. Why didn't you help her? Why let her return to the Bluebell Inn, knowing she was being hunted? She insisted, said she had to see it through. She intended to publish Altham's writings, and with them a list of names. She believed exposure was the only way to stop them. And the Reverend Ponsby? A pawn, Lyon said bitterly. They keep men like him on the fringes, loyal, silenced, dispensable. Holmes stepped back into the centre of the chapel, staring at the worn altar. So she came here seeking absolution, and walked back into the fire. She left something. Behind, Lyon added. For you. He reached into the vestry drawer and produced a folded envelope, slightly water-stained, but sealed with the same tree and branch crest. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single key, tied to a length of string, and a brief note in Marjorie Hartwood's hand. If I vanish, seek the door below the stairs. Bluebell Inn, cellar wall, 3 bricks to the right of the coal chute. Holmes met my eyes. She never planned to run, I said quietly. No, Holmes replied. She planned for the worst. Outside, the fog had lifted just enough to reveal the winding road back to Elcombe. As we stepped into the light, I looked back once more at the headstone of Edwin Altham. He bore the mark, and now Holmes and I bore the responsibility to find the truth that Marjorie had tried to free, and the man who vanished like smoke before he could silence her forever. Chapter 8. The Door Below the Stairs. We arrived back at the Bluebell Inn as twilight fell, a cold, brittle dusk that bathed the building in the colour of damp slate. Holmes moved quickly, wasting no words with Mr. Toller or the constable. He ascended the rear corridor like a man retracing the path of a ghost, and stopped at the linen rack where we had first glimpsed the cellar door. The inn was quiet, too quiet, 3 bricks to the right of the coal chute, Holmes murmured, producing the key Marjorie Hartwood had left behind. He knelt before the wall adjacent to the coal shaft, a narrow wooden flap that opened into the exterior courtyard, and began tapping at the bricks. I watched the line of his jaw tighten as he reached the 3rd from the chute's edge. It gave a muted thud, hollow, unlike the rest. A false face, he said. Help me, Watson. Together, we cleared the crates of kindling and dislodged the brick, revealing a small metal panel set into the wall. It bore no markings, no lock, only a thin seam and a slight indentation, barely large enough for the key's narrow tip. Holmes inserted it, turned it once, and with a soft click, the metal door sprang open on a hidden hinge. Behind it, a narrow passage descended. The air that spilled out was like a tomb, cold, dry, and tinged with rot. Holmes lit a lantern from the wall sconce and descended first. I followed, my every footstep echoing on the stone stairs. The shaft turned sharply to the left after 10 steps, and then again, until we emerged into a small bricked chamber no more than 10 feet square. It had once been a coal store, by the look of the soot that still clung to the far wall, but it had been repurposed. The centre of the room held a single iron chair, bolted to the floor. Leather restraints lay unbuckled at its sides. Chains hung from the wall beside it, though they looked as though they had not been used in some time. The ground, half covered by straw, was a dark wool cloak, embroidered faintly at the edge with a broken tree. I stepped forward, revolted. What sort of place is this? A confessional, Holmes said coldly, but not for absolution, for coercion. He moved to a small shelf cut into the brick. A journal lay there, its pages curled with moisture. Holmes opened it, reading, in silence. It's hers, he said after a moment. Her copy of Altham's writings. Coded entries, names, symbols. The old methods of the Brotherhood. I believe this was meant for us to find. At that moment something scraped behind us, a soft shuffle above, near the entrance. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood in darkness, silent. Footsteps. 1, 2, then a pause. The sound of breathing, low and deliberate. Someone was listening. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a length of wire from his kit. Silently, he handed it to me and pointed upward, his meaning unmistakable. Go around, surprise from above. I ascended carefully, creeping along the passage and emerging behind the linen rack once more. My heart pounded as I peeked around the wood, just in time to see the cellar door creak open. A figure slipped inside, tall, gloved, a long dark coat, his hat brim low, face obscured. He passed beneath me unaware. I waited only a moment, then slipped down the hallway to the main corridor, ran past the kitchen, and came down the front stairs, looping around. By the time I burst into the hidden room again, revolver drawn, Holmes had lit the lantern, and the man had turned, caught in the full beam. It was Reverend Ponsby, or rather, the man who had pretended to be him. The vow of silence had vanished from his demeanour. He stood upright, alert, his eyes scanning Holmes, then me, then the room, with cold calculation. "You're not Ponsby," Holmes said. "You were never a priest." "No," the man replied. His voice was deep, cultured, but the garb proved useful. Why return? To ensure the journal was gone, to confirm what she left behind. He stepped forward slowly. "You don't know what you're involving yourselves in. This isn't about one woman. It's about history, doctrine, faith." Holmes didn't flinch. "You mean secrecy, punishment, control." The man smirked. "Call it what you will. We are older than any police force. You cannot dismantle what you do not understand." I moved behind him, revolver raised. "I believe," Holmes said coolly, "we understand more than you think." The man hesitated. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, He pulled a small vial from his pocket and hurled it at the ground. The glass shattered. Ether. The scent flooded the room. He moved fast, but Holmes was faster. With a lunge, Holmes grabbed his wrist and twisted. The man howled and struck out blindly. I caught him from behind and tackled him to the floor, my pistol clattering aside as we struggled in the straw. Holmes brought the lantern down hard beside the man's head, not striking him, but startling him enough for me to get the upper hand. I rolled him over and held him down. The scuffle had ended, but the quiet that followed was heavier than before. Holmes straightened, winded but steady. "We need rope, and Mr. Toller." The man sneered, a cut dripping from his lip. "You think? This ends with me. There are others. She will never be safe." Holmes knelt beside him. "If she's alive, I will find her. And if she's not, then I will find you all." We bound him and locked the hidden passage behind us. As Holmes and I stood in the cold corridor once more, the lantern flickering, I asked quietly, "Do you believe him?" Holmes looked at me gravely. "Yes, and that is why we must go faster. Someone else may already be on her trail. We may have hours, not days." He looked down at the key still in his palm, Marjorie's key. "She trusted no one," he whispered, "except perhaps a ghost of justice." I knew then that this case, strange as it had become something more. Not only a mystery, or a reckoning. Chapter 9. The Second Attempt. The man posing as Reverend Ponsonby had been placed under the supervision of Constable Rigby, who, though visibly unnerved by the implications, followed Holmes's instructions with quiet diligence. We locked the impostor in the inn storeroom, with his wrists bound and ankles shackled. Holmes took no chances. A second key was fashioned, and Rigby was ordered not to leave his post for any reason. "He may not be the head," Holmes said to me as we stood outside the door, "but he is most certainly one of the hands, and hands do the dirtiest work." We returned to the common room just past midnight. The fire had burned low. Wind hissed faintly through the eaves. Holmes sat before the hearth, the recovered journal open in his lap, the broken ribbon scrap, and the key to the hidden chamber laid beside it like the components of a spell. I paced. This can't be the end. If what he said is true about others, then Marjorie is still in danger. Holmes didn't look up. More than danger. She is the last bearer of the ledger. That makes her both target and threat. And I am convinced now that the well at Addleton was not the intended grave. You think they moved her? I think they tried to, and failed. At that moment, Toller burst in, breathless, face pale. "Mr. Holmes! Constable Rigby! He's unconscious!" We ran to the storeroom. Rigby lay slumped against the wall, a deep bruise along his temple. The door was ajar. The lock splintered from the inside. The impostor was gone. "No sign of forced entry," Holmes said after examining the hinges. He had help. Someone else inside the inn still. We turned the place upside down. Every room was searched, every closet opened. But the man had vanished as thoroughly as Marjorie Hartwood had. "I underestimated him," Holmes said grimly. "He waited until we believed him defeated. Classic misdirection. But this was not an escape for freedom. He turned to Toller. Was anyone else seen downstairs? Any guest? Any stranger? No, sir, Toller replied, trembling. Everyone was in their rooms, lights off, doors closed. Holmes looked up the stairs, his jaw tense. Not everyone, Toller. A moment later, he knocked briskly at Mr. Greeley's door. It opened with an unusual delay. The solicitor stood in his dressing robe, adjusting his spectacles. Mr. Holmes, what is the matter? Holmes didn't answer. He walked straight past Greeley into the room and opened the wardrobe. A long dark coat hung inside. In the pockets he found gloves, not damning in themselves, but the hem of the coat bore a faint smear, grey, powdery. Holmes rubbed it between his fingers. Stone dust, fresh. Greeley paled. Explain yourself. You said you had no further business in Addleton, and yet the dust from that collapsed estate clings to your coat. That, and your insistence that the journal was of no legal value, suggest you visited the place more recently than you admit. I was curious, Greeley said stiffly. After our conversation, You went back to find her, Holmes interrupted, or what was left, but she wasn't there, was she? Greeley sat heavily in the armchair. No, just disturbed earth near the well. I thought she'd been buried. I thought it was over, but she wasn't, Holmes said almost softly. She outwitted them. She left the ledger, planted the key, and returned here. And she knew it would all come to a second attempt. At that moment, a noise broke the air. A sharp creak from the rear of the inn. Holmes turned at once. The coal chute, he said. He's come back to finish it. We rushed through the kitchen and into the cellar corridor. A figure was crouched at the chute's edge, lantern raised, his back to us. Stop! Holmes shouted. The man turned, this one unfamiliar, not Ponsonby's impostor. A different figure altogether, wiry, narrow-faced, with an unnatural stillness about him, and in his hand, clutched like a sacred relic, was the journal. He ran. Holmes gave chase without hesitation, and I followed, heart hammering. The figure fled through the coal door and out into the night beyond. The rear courtyard slick with rain, shadows twisted by moonlight. We cornered him near the stable. Drop it! Holmes barked. The man hesitated, then, with startling calm, reached into his coat. Not a weapon, but a small flask. Holmes lunged forward just as he raised it, and struck it from his hand. It shattered. Ether again. Holmes gritted his teeth. That scent trails this case like a phantom. The man struggled, but Holmes held firm. I secured his arms with the twine from my coat pocket, and we dragged him inside. I know your face, Holmes said, panting. I saw you in the asylum photograph. You were one of the attendants. The man said nothing, but his silence was not ignorance. It was training. He's a disciple, Holmes muttered, not a leader. He's been sent. Then who commands him now? I asked. Holmes stood and looked to the cellar door. Still, open, the shadows beyond it seeming deeper now. The same man who was once called Father Caleb, Holmes said quietly. He's out there still, watching. We left at the disciple bound and summoned the authorities. This time they came in pairs, rifles in hand, but I could tell Holmes was not satisfied. He stood at the window long into the night. the ledger in hand, his fingers tapping along its spine. "They're accelerating," he said. "The order is wounded. They've moved too soon." I said, "You believe they fear we're close?" "No, Watson. They know we are." He held up the ledger, eyes gleaming, and now we have the map. Chapter 10. The ledger's secret. It was nearly dawn by the time Holmes and I returned to our quarters, the events of the night still pressing heavily upon us. The rain had ceased, but the air remained thick, charged with a kind of tension I had only known in battlefields and death chambers. Holmes sat by the window with the ledger resting on his knees, the dim light from the oil lamp throwing shifting shadows across his face. He had scarcely spoken since the disciples' capture. "The writing changes," he said suddenly, his voice low but alert. "Look at this, Watson." I crossed the room and leaned over his shoulder. The ledger, Marjorie Hartwood's copy of Edwin Altham's forbidden writings, had been encoded, as Holmes had suspected. Most of it had been transcribed, in a neat, compact hand, filled with odd abbreviations, astrological signs, and Latin phrases. But now, in the later pages, the style changed. "These final entries are hers," Holmes murmured. "Her own words, her own annotations." He turned a page. Marjorie had written in hurried, uneven script, as if under duress. March 14th. They know I have the list. Father Caleb is still alive. He walks with another name now. They meet beneath stone, in the circle where voices do not echo. The entrance lies in shadow, where 3 roads meet and one must bow to pass. March 15th. They will come for me. If I am taken, the ledger must survive. The ledger is the map. "Where voices do not echo," I repeated. What could she mean? Holmes was already standing, pacing. Some structure, underground perhaps, but natural. A cavern, a chamber. And where 3 roads meet. A crossroads. A symbolic one, perhaps. Or literal. He turned to the back of the ledger and carefully peeled back the cloth binding. Inside, concealed against the rear board, was a folded parchment. Fragile, yellowed with age. Holmes unfolded it on the writing desk. It was a map, a hand-drawn sketch of the Hampshire countryside, centred not on Elcombe nor Addleton, but on a small, densely wooded region several miles to the southeast, labelled only as the Hollow of Briar's Edge. Holmes traced the paths on the parchment. 3 lanes, one from Hatherden, one from Westley Ridge, and one here from the Bluebell Inn itself. They converge at a place marked with a circle, and the phrase Sylvae Obscurae, the shadowed woods. He tapped the mark. That's where she believed they gathered, where the Brotherhood, or what remains of it, still hides. I frowned. But why return there? Why not flee? Because she believed the only way to end them was from within. She was never trying to disappear. Watson, she was drawing them out. And if she succeeded, then she may have left another trail for us to follow. I looked back to the journal. The entrance lies in shadow, where one must bow to pass. A low arch? A collapsed tunnel? Or something older? Druidic, perhaps? A burial site, a sinkhole? These woods are littered with forgotten rites. Holmes packed the ledger and map into his satchel, securing the flap with deliberate care. Then he retrieved the pistol from the nightstand drawer and slipped it into his coat. "We leave within the hour," he said. "We shall take the old trail from behind the inn. If we're being watched, they'll expect us to wait for daybreak." Paused, still adjusting to the speed of his transition. "And if it's a trap?" He gave me a grim smile. "Then I prefer to spring it before it's reset." We departed without alerting the others. Holmes left a note for Constable Rigby instructing him to alert Scotland Yard should we not return by nightfall. He gave no details, only coordinates. By the time we reached the footpath behind the inn, the sky was turning the dull pewter of early morning. The forest ahead loomed like a wall. Fog clung to the branches in pale tresses. Holmes walked with precise steps, consulting the map with every change in terrain. "Listen," he said once, pausing. I did, and heard nothing. "No bird song," I whispered, "nor echo." The path narrowed, then twisted sharply through the undergrowth, the trees now so thick we had to duck and press sideways through them. The further we travelled, the more the light dimmed, even as morning progressed. And then, just as the map predicted, the three paths merged beneath a grove of ancient yews, their trunks gnarled like arthritic hands. Ahead was a rise, a tangle of earth and stone that jutted from the forest floor like a jagged spine. Holmes approached it slowly. "There," he said. "Do you see?" I followed his finger. Half concealed by moss and lichen was a blackened archway, only 4 feet high, set into the mound. The stonework bore faint carvings, almost eroded to nothing. But at the centre of the arch, barely visible in the dim light, was the unmistakable sigil, a tree with one branch snapped clean. Holmes crouched and produced a match, lighting a small lantern. The tunnel sloped downward steeply, the scent of earth and mildew pressing from within. "We bow to enter," he murmured. We exchanged a glance, then, without another word, Holmes stepped forward into the dark, and I, heart-pounding, followed him into the hollow where voices did not echo. Chapter 11. Beneath the hollow of Briar's Edge. The archway consumed us like the mouth of some slumbering beast. As we ducked inside, the light from Holmes's lantern pushed back only a fraction of the blackness. The air was dense with the smell of ancient soil, damp, fetid, and cold, and there was something else beneath it, the faint bitter tang of ether. The tunnel sloped down sharply, the walls narrowing until they brushed our shoulders. Roots hung from above like skeletal fingers, and the silence was total. No wind, no dripping water, only our footfalls and the rasp of our breath. I whispered, "Do you suppose they're here?" Holmes's reply came in a hush. "Not all, but perhaps one, or what remains of one." We continued in silence for what felt like a quarter of an hour, until the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. It was circular, with a domed ceiling of stone, and carved symbols running along its circumference, worn, almost druidic, their meanings long lost. The centre of the chamber contained a raised stone table, and at its base were half-melted candles arranged in a deliberate ring. A ritual space. Holmes lowered the lantern to examine the floor. There are recent footprints, at least 2 sets, one quite small. I felt the chill rise through my spine. Hers? Perhaps. Or they led her here. he stepped toward a shadowed alcove in the far wall, where a rusted metal gate had been fitted into a jagged stone opening. A chain lock hung from it, recently broken. The metal had snapped clean. Someone forced their way through, Holmes murmured. "Come." We passed through the gate and into a smaller corridor. The floor here was lined with gravel, the walls damp and glistening. After a short bend, the tunnel opened again, this time into a room that had clearly once been man-made. Bricks formed a tight enclosure, and there were iron brackets along the wall, as if once used for shackles. But it was the writing that froze us both. Carved into the far wall, with a trembling hand and what looked to be a knife, were 5 words. "Still here, still alive." Ems Holmes leaned in, brushing the moss gently from the letters. She made it here, and she had time to carve this. That means they hadn't taken her yet, or she escaped. He turned to scan the room. Look for passageways. Anything that leads further in or out. I moved to the far wall, running my hands along the brick. One section felt different, colder, slightly recessed. I pressed. There was a soft click, and a slab of wall shifted inward. Holmes stepped beside me, lantern raised. Beyond the hidden door was a narrow stair, leading downward again, into what could only be described as a crypt. This was no longer the work of the Brotherhood. This was older, forgotten. The air here was colder, heavier, and the moment we crossed the threshold, even the flame of the lantern seemed to flicker less brightly. The chamber at the bottom was vast and oval, with rows of stone niches carved into the walls, each housing an urn or a relic of the dead. But at the centre, beneath, a single crumbling pillar, was a cot, and on that cot, chained but breathing, lay Marjorie Hartwood. Her hair was matted and her cheeks sunken, but her eyes opened the instant our light touched her face. She squinted, dazed, and then recognition dawned. She tried to speak but coughed instead. Holmes was already at her side, producing a flask of water from his coat. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe now. You left us the trail. We followed it." She drank slowly, then whispered, He's still here, in the shadows. He never left this place." Holmes turned to me. "Check the tunnel. If he's close, we must not be caught in here." I ran back up the stone steps, retracing our path through the secret door. For a moment there was only silence. Then I heard it. A faint scrape of gravel behind me. I spun, revolver raised, but there was no one. I returned to the chamber, my nerves on fire. "We're alone, for now." Holmes had already freed her bonds and was helping her sit up. "You were right about the ledger," she said weakly. "It shook them. I heard them arguing. Some wanted to flee. Others wanted to kill me outright." "And Father Caleb?" Holmes asked. "Did you see him?" She nodded. "Only once. He wears another face now, but it's him, the voice, the eyes. He never aged." Holmes turned grim. "He's hiding here still, or waiting for us to leave so he can destroy what remains." I looked back toward the crypt's entrance. Then we leave nothing. We gathered the few remnants in the chamber. Marjorie's journal, a broken medallion bearing the same tree crest, and made our way back up, carrying her between us. She was weak but conscious, murmuring names, Lion, Altham, and another I did not know, Lorne. We emerged into the ritual chamber just as the first rays of morning pierced the yew canopy above, casting fractured light through the arch we had entered. Hours earlier, but Holmes stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on a stone shelf at the edge of the room. There, placed with ceremonial care, was a mask. It was carved from pale wood, smooth and expressionless, but the eyes had been hollowed into deep ovals, and across the forehead the symbol of the broken tree had been painted in red. Holmes stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he took a sheet of linen from his bag and wrapped it carefully, tucking it into his satchel beside the ledger. "It's not over," he said. "No," I replied, "but she's alive." He nodded. "And now, so is the truth behind us." The hollow of Briar's Edge receded into darkness once more, its silence broken at last. Chapter 12. Shadows in the Light. We returned to the Bluebell Inn just past mid-morning. The sky over Hampshire, a soft, uncertain grey. The forest had released us, but its memory clung to every step. Earth beneath the nails, dried moss on our boots, and the strange, sour tang of that crypt still trailing in the seams of our coats. Marjorie Hartwood lay weak but lucid in the carriage Holmes had arranged to meet us at the forest's edge. Her fingers gripped Holmes's wrist when he tried to leave her side, and she would not speak a word until the safety of stone walls and warm fire surrounded her again. Mr. Toller was speechless when we entered with her, his hands trembling so violently that the cup of tea he had been carrying splashed across the floor. "Alive?" he gasped. "But how?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He merely pointed to the upstairs rooms. "Prepare the corner chamber, but remove any locks from the outside. She is not a guest now. She is a witness." Within the hour, she was resting under several blankets, a faint colour returning to her cheeks. I sat beside her while Holmes, as ever, resumed his pacing, his mind running ahead of us all. "I had accepted death," Marjorie said, her voice no more than a hush. "They had taken everything, the ledger, my words, my name, but the mask. He wore the mask." Holmes stopped. "One we found?" "Yes, it wasn't just a symbol. It was their identity, each of them. The Brotherhood hides behind one face, but the eyes were his. Father Caleb," she nodded weakly. "He calls himself Lorne now, or claimed to, but I knew. He was always the one who never raised his voice. He didn't need to. People obeyed him. He would come and stand in the shadows of the asylum's ward and say nothing. The others would fall silent. That's how he commanded. Do you believe he saw you escape? I think yes, but he allowed it, or wanted it. That's the part I still don't understand." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Because he knew you would lead us back," I said softly. Holmes nodded. He wanted the ledger, certainly, but more than that, he wanted to know who else might discover it. I felt a slow dread grow in my chest. "He's hunting us now." "No," Holmes said. "He's studying us." Holmes turned to the satchel and opened it again. He unwrapped the mask, set it on the desk, and pulled the ledger free beside it. The mask stared back blankly from the wood grain, its hollow eyes fixed on nothing, but seeming to see everything. "What do you know of this name?" "Lorne, Holmes," asked Marjorie. She hesitated. "It was whispered at the chapel. Lion mentioned it once, too. Said it had meaning to the older members of the order. A cleansed name. A title." Holmes nodded, thoughtful. "We must speak with Lion again. He gave us one truth, but I suspect he kept others close. I'm not sure he'll speak now," I said. "Not after this." "He will," Holmes replied quietly, "because he knows that if he doesn't, the mask may soon be worn by someone else. We left Marjorie in Toller's care, with firm instructions that no one outside the constables was to be told of her survival, not even Greeley. Holmes believed, and I agreed, that news of her return would travel far too fast among those we had yet to see. By afternoon we were on the road again, this time not to a forest or forgotten ruin, but to a house of the living. Mr. Lion had taken refuge at his cottage near the outskirts of Hatherden, a crumbling place set back from the road, surrounded by hedgerows and a crooked gate. He answered Holmes's knock with tired eyes, clutching a mug of tea and a dog-eared prayer book. "You found her," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and now we must find him." Lion stepped aside. Inside, the air was stale with pipe smoke and dust. Papers covered every surface, sermons half-written, old letters, and beneath one stack, a copy of the Acts of St. Theophilus, annotated heavily in the margins. "I thought once that I could undo what I helped build," Lion said quietly. "But the roots go deeper than confession. They go down to blood and fear." "What was Lorne's true role?" Holmes asked. "He was not a priest, not in any official sense. He was a purifier. That's what they called him. When a member questioned doctrine, when a nurse or child refused discipline, he came, and they disappeared. Did he kill them?" Lion stared at the fire. "I never saw him do it, but I never saw them again, and no one ever asked why." "Why the mask?" "Did you say? Remind you that it wasn't a man judging you. It was the order." Holmes stepped closer. "He's still operating. He has agents. One escaped from the inn. Another nearly destroyed the ledger. You must tell me where he would run now." Lion hesitated. Then, with a sigh that seemed to lift the weight of years, he stood and opened a drawer. From within he retrieved a map, not unlike the one Marjorie had hidden. This one, however, bore a crest at its edge, drawn in red wax. The broken tree. He laid it flat. "This is the other hollow, the one the Brotherhood called the Chalice. It was their place of final judgment. If Lorne has returned to seal this, that is where he will make his stand." Holmes leaned over the map, and if Marjorie's name still sits upon their list, then she is not yet safe. He folded the map slowly and slid it into his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Lion. You've done what you can. Now, it's our turn to finish this." As we stepped out into the fading light of day, the clouds above broke for the first time in days, casting long streaks of gold over the horizon. But neither Holmes nor I remarked upon it. We were no longer simply hunting a murderer. We were hunting a legacy. And it was not finished with us yet. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape by nightfall. The clouds had thickened once more, swallowing the last of the evening's gold and replacing it with a heavy, foreboding grey. We returned to the Bluebell Inn under cover of dusk, every window shuttered and the door bolted tight. The village lay still. No carriages passed. Even the constables who guarded the entrance to the inn seemed subdued, as if some unspoken pressure had gripped the air. Marjorie Hartwood was awake when we entered her room, sitting upright in bed with a wool shawl around her shoulders. She had insisted on being moved closer to the front of the inn. "So I can see the road," she said, though what she expected to see there she would not say. "You should rest," I said gently. "There's no rest while he's still out there," she replied, eyes sharp. "He doesn't forgive. He waits." Holmes stepped forward. "He'll wait no longer. We have what he wants. That makes us the bait now." Marjorie's hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Then you must be ready, because he'll come not as a shadow in the woods, but as someone you've already spoken to." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He told me once, long ago, at the asylum, that the perfect disciple doesn't come from the outside. It is someone already inside the walls, already trusted." Holmes went still. "You believe someone within the inn is still acting on his behalf?" She nodded. "I was drugged the night before I vanished. Not by the man who posed as Ponsby. He came later. It was someone with access. Someone who knew when I took my tea." Toller. I felt a chill that was not from the window draught. Holmes seemed to read my thought and shook his head. "No, Toller's reactions have been too raw. If he were acting, he would have slipped by now. But someone else." He turned sharply and strode from the room. Downstairs, the common room was empty save for the crackling hearth. Greeley, the solicitor, sat in his usual armchair, reading a leather-bound volume. He looked up at our approach. Holmes did not speak. He simply moved to the hearth and knelt, inspecting the ashes. Then he reached into the iron grate and withdrew a long-handled poker. He examined it silently, then looked back at Greeley. "You visited Addleton," Holmes said calmly. Greeley blinked. "I've told you. You also visited St. Emmeren's Chapel before us. You knew Marjorie had gone there, and you hoped to intercept what she left behind. That's why your coat bore stone dust. But more than that." He lifted the poker. This was recently scrubbed, not to clean soot, but to remove blood. Greeley set his book down, his face hardening. "I warn you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped closer. "You drugged her. You brought her down to the cellar, handed her over to the impostor. You assumed it would be quick. But it wasn't, was it? She struggled. She left behind marks you couldn't erase." Greeley's hand twitched. "Scotland Yard is on their way," Holmes added. "Your last chance at mercy lies in truth." "I did what I was told," Greeley said at last. His voice had dropped into something bitter, hoarse. "I was chosen. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, but she kept digging. She threatened to ruin everything. Do you know what it cost me to keep that silence?" "You didn't keep it," Holmes said coldly. "You tried to erase it." Greeley stood, knocking over the chair. "It's not me you should fear, Holmes. You think you've solved it? You haven't even begun." From within his coat he drew a small vial. "Ether again," Holmes muttered. But this time Greeley wasn't aiming to drug. He hurled the vial at the fire. The flames roared upward in a sudden plume of heat and smoke. "Watson, get Marjorie!" Holmes shouted. I ran as the smoke surged up the stairs. Behind me, I heard the clatter of a struggle. Holmes grappling with Greeley. I turned at the landing and saw the solicitor twist free and dash toward the back exit, smoke trailing him like a cloak. Marjorie was already rising when I reached her. "Come, quickly!" We wrapped a blanket over her shoulders and made our way out, coughing, the hallway filling with dark grey haze. Tola met us on the stairs with a wet cloth pressed to his face. "Out the front! Constables are clearing the path." As we emerged into the courtyard, Holmes joined us, soot smudged across his cheek, but otherwise unharmed. He fled through the rear, Rigby's giving chase. We watched the flames consume the far wall of the inn before the village brigade arrived. Water hissed and steam billowed. By then, the fire had revealed more than just Greeley's treachery. In the cellar, hidden beneath the boards where the ritual chair had stood, was a sealed trapdoor. It led not to another room, but to a narrow tunnel now choked with ash. "A second exit," Holmes said, crouching over it. That's how she was moved. Not through the front, through the hidden path. "And if Greeley used it once," I added, "others may still be watching it." Holmes turned to the constable beside him. "Double the guard on Miss Hartwood, and post men at the edge of Briar's Edge. We're no longer waiting for them to come to us." "But what if they already have?" I asked. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he stared into the dying fire, where the mask, set on the mantel before, the blaze had blackened but not burned. Its hollow eyes, cracked but intact, reflected the flickering embers. The final move, we knew, had begun. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The fire at the Bluebell Inn had been controlled, but its scars lingered. One wall of the common room was scorched to blackened timber, and smoke had stained the upper corridor ceilings like smudged charcoal drawings. Marjorie was moved to the vicarage under armed guard, and Constable Rigby redoubled patrols through the village lanes. But the man we wanted, Greeley, had vanished once again. "He's not running," Holmes said the following morning, eyes fixed on the charred remains of the poker he now held with a handkerchief. "He's circling." We stood in the remains of the common room, our boots crunching over damp ash. The dawn light filtered through broken shutters, casting long grey shadows across the walls. "Circling?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He believes he is still useful to Lorne. Disposable, yes, but not yet discarded, which means he'll attempt contact. But Lorne, I suspect, is already prepared to sacrifice him." He knelt beside the hearth, where the fire had burned hottest. With gloved fingers, he pulled aside the remains of the mantle and retrieved something from the crumbled base. Half-melted wax, fused with fragments of parchment. He held it up to the light. "A seal," he murmured. "Broken, but familiar." I leaned in. "The crest. Yes, but look at this." He gestured to the parchment edge, on which a fragment of handwriting remained. "Not Marjorie's. This ink is iron gall, and this hand is far older." He tucked it carefully into a leather folder and stood. "They burned something here, something they could not risk being found." "You believe Greeley came here to retrieve it?" "No. He came to destroy it, under orders." He stared into the soot as if it were a map. "The final clue," murmured, "is not where they left her. It's where they sent their others." I frowned. "You mean the vanished patients? The ones Marjorie referenced in the ledger?" He nodded. "Altham and others. each recorded, each erased. The Brotherhood called it cleansing, but they needed a place to put what was left. He returned to the table and spread the map Lion had given us. Beside it, he placed the crumbling remains of the wax seal. I thought the hollow of Briar's Edge was their deepest refuge. It isn't. He pointed to a second mark, one we had glossed over days earlier, a circle deep in the woods further south than the hollow. The chalice, I said. Lion mentioned it. Yes. And look, these trails around it are not roads. They're waterways. A reservoir? A quarry, Holmes corrected. Once mined for chalk, now flooded. Ideal for concealment. I felt the chill return. You believe they're there? And I believe their final rites, whatever remained of them, were performed there. Cleansing by fire, cleansing by ether, and I suspect cleansing by water. And Marjorie? She was to be taken there. But Greeley failed. Now, they must act quickly. They'll abandon the site soon, burn it, collapse it, or worse. And if Lorne is there... He did not finish the sentence. Instead, he snapped the folder shut and began gathering supplies. An hour later, we rode out from Elcombe with a small party. Holmes, myself, Constable Rigby, and 2 local watchmen. We followed the stream beyond, Briar's Edge, through the bramble-choked trails, and into the lower woods, where the land sagged into a shallow basin. The quarry appeared through the trees like a black mirror, still, silent, its edges framed by the skeletons of half-felled trees and crumbling stone. The water was dark, not from depth, but from something thicker that clung to its surface. Oil, perhaps, or the residue of something burned. Holmes dismounted and crouched near the edge. Recently disturbed, he said, running his fingers along the moss-covered stones. Boot prints, at least 3 men, one dragging something. A faint path wound along the southern edge of the quarry, where an old mining shed sagged beneath the weight of its rotting roof. We approached slowly, rifles raised. Inside was silence until Holmes touched the door. It creaked open to reveal a single chair, facing a table, and on the table the mask, but not the same one. This one was newer, clean, its wood unstained, but the eyes, always the eyes, had been carved in the same familiar ovals. And this time, below the mark of the broken tree, a name had been etched. Lorne. Holmes stepped inside. He left this for us, he said. An invitation, or a warning. Beneath the mask was a letter, folded, sealed in wax. Holmes opened it, read it silently, then handed it to me. Mr. Holmes, you have proven yourself a man of rare persistence. It would be wrong of me not to acknowledge that. But you are chasing shadows that were already vanishing when I first donned the mask. We are not a cult, nor a brotherhood. We are something far more dangerous. A habit, a memory. You may unmask one of us, even bury a few. But you cannot kill what lingers in doctrine and blood. Let her go. Let the past rot. Or follow it and join it. Lorne Rigby exhaled. He's taunting us. No, Holmes said. He's preparing to vanish. Again. This is the end game. I looked at the water. If he's here, we need to search the quarry. Holmes turned, eyes steeled. We will, but not blindly. He expects pursuit. So we give him silence. We'll watch. We'll wait. Tonight, we let him believe the mask holds the final word. He picked it up, studied it one last time, then placed it inside the satchel. As we turned to leave, Holmes paused once more to survey the black water. He said, "A memory cannot be killed," he murmured. Then he looked to me. "But a man can, and he will be found." The final clue at last had a face, and the hunt for the man behind the mask was nearly at its end. Chapter 15. The final gathering that evening back at the Bluebell Inn. Now quiet, but no longer quite so whole, Holmes gathered all remaining parties in the drawing-room, as though preparing for a performance. The curtains had been drawn tight, the soot-stained hearth scrubbed, and a new lantern placed on the mantel in place of the one consumed in the fire. The smell of damp wood still lingered, but there was something sharper in the air now. Anticipation. Holmes stood before the fire, hands behind his back, the satchel resting at his feet. Marjorie, pale but upright, was seated in a high-backed chair with a blanket across her knees. Toller stood near the door, visibly anxious. Constable Rigby, stone-faced, flanked the wall, and beside him sat the last of our known players, Mr. Lyon, summoned quietly from Hatherden by Holmes's own hand. Even Greeley had been brought back under watchful escort, caught in a trap laid by Holmes himself, hiding in a barn just outside Elcombe, attempting to reach a contact that had never been there. The room was full. Tension hummed beneath the surface, like the moment before a bell tolls. Holmes began. "You are all here," he said evenly, "because you played a role in what has taken place, not just in the last week, but in the last 2 decades. Each of you holds a piece of a story that was never supposed to be told. Tonight, we will fit those pieces together, and when we are done, there will be no more masks." He turned to Lyon. "Let us begin with the truth you have long hidden, the man once known as Father Caleb." Lyon looked down, his jaw clenched. His real name was Emery Lorne. Born Emery Cairn, he changed it after leaving the seminary. Learned this too late, long after I'd helped install him as spiritual guide at St. Miriam's. He was persuasive, quiet, brilliant, but inside, hollow. Holmes nodded. He founded the Brotherhood of the Broken Tree, not as a religion, but as a refuge for men like himself. Men who believed obedience was worth more than morality. Toller made a strangled sound, half gasp, half whisper. "That crest, I've seen it carved into the cellar wall before we plastered it over. You said it was just old superstition." "Because it was safer that way," Lyon murmured. "We believed we'd buried it. You didn't," Holmes replied coldly. "You buried only the evidence." He stepped toward the centre of the room and placed 3 items on the table: the ledger, the mask-marked lawn, and the photograph from St. Miriam's Asylum. He then produced the note found at the quarry. "This letter," Holmes said, "was Lorne's farewell, but it was also a challenge. He wanted us to know we were chasing the memory of something unkillable. Doctrine, habit, silence." He looked at Greeley, whose face was tight with defiance. But what Lorne failed to understand is that memory can be recorded, and that is why Marjorie Hartwood survived. Holmes turned to her. "Tell them what you hid." Marjorie took a slow breath and nodded. "I knew the ledger alone wasn't enough. If they destroyed it, they'd win. So I left fragments elsewhere. a letter with Lion, a coded message in Addleton's property records, even the photograph, the only one showing the original 7. Lorne wanted to erase himself. I made sure he couldn't. Holmes smiled faintly. A trap, and he walked into it. He then turned to Rigby. Constable, Greeley was not just a participant. He was the bridge, the go-between. He contacted others, arranged the handoffs, but the real hand behind him still walks free. And if I am correct, he is not far. Are you saying, I asked slowly, that Lorne is still in Elcombe? I am, Holmes said. He is a man who believes in closing the circle. He started here, at Addleton, at the chapel, in these woods. He intends to end here too. A knock echoed from the door. Rigby moved swiftly, rifle raised. Holmes stopped him with a gesture. No need. He strode to the door and opened it himself. A man stood in the fog beyond, cloaked, hat low. He stepped inside slowly, his boots leaving faint damp marks on the floor. Holmes closed the door behind him. Mr. Lorne, he said, you've come for your finale. The man removed his hat. He was older than we had imagined, perhaps in his late 60s, with a gaunt, pale face and colourless eyes. But his posture was that of a younger man, erect, deliberate, unafraid. I came, Lorne said softly, because I believe even predators deserve to choose the ground on which they fall. Rigby moved to restrain him, but Holmes again held up his hand. Let him speak. Lorne glanced at Marjorie. You survived. I underestimated your resolve. You underestimated my memory, she said coldly. He nodded. You recorded more than I thought, but not enough to understand us. Holmes replied, I understand enough. Enough to know that you built your brotherhood not on faith but fear, and fear, Mr. Lorne, does not last forever. Lorne looked down at the ledger. Burn it. The pages lie. No, Holmes said, they remember, and that is why your brotherhood ends tonight. Rigby stepped forward now, rifle at the ready. You'll come with me. Lorne raised his hands without resistance. Do what you will, but there will be others. Holmes turned to him. Perhaps, but they won't have your face, or your voice, or your silence. As Lorne was led away, the room exhaled all at once. Marjorie closed her eyes. Lion looked down at the floor, shoulders slack. Holmes stood still, but his gaze was distant. I touched his shoulder. It's over. He nodded slowly. Yes, Watson, but as he said, memory lingers, and the memory of what we had unearthed that week, of the shadows cast by doctrine, of the mask passed down from hand to hand, would linger far longer than the man who created it. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was just past midnight when the last echoes of Lorne's footsteps faded beyond the heavy oak door of the Bluebell Inn. The constables had escorted him under heavy guard, his wrists manacled, his eyes calm even as he disappeared into the fog-bound street. He had said nothing more, not a protest, not a plea, not even a farewell. Only silence. We remained in the drawing-room, myself, Marjorie, Lion, Toller, Rigby and Holmes, each of us seated like weary jurors awaiting a final verdict. The fire crackled in the hearth once more, now properly tended, as if the very act of containment had returned order to a place that had nearly succumbed to chaos. Holmes stood before us. He had not sat down once. His hands were clasped behind, his back, his face composed but alert. The mask lay on the mantelpiece like a vanquished icon. The ledger sat beside it, open to a page marked by Holmes's own hand. "Now," he said quietly, "you deserve to understand how it all came together." He turned to Marjorie first. "You were correct, Miss Hartwood. Lorne, formerly known as Father Caleb, never intended to kill you immediately. He needed you silent, yes, but more than that, he needed your ledger intact. You, after all, were the bait he designed, not for the police, but for me." She blinked, startled. "You?" Holmes nodded. He knew I could not resist a riddle, and he knew that only by bringing me into the fold could he learn which parts of his past remained vulnerable. Toller stepped forward slightly. "But why? Here? Why the Bluebell Inn?" "Because this place," Holmes said, "was not chosen at random. It is the geographical centre of what the Brotherhood once called the Triad of the Hollow, Addleton, St. Emeran's, and the quarry at Briar's Edge. It is the last unmarked corner of the map, the point from which they operated, but never documented." He gestured to the burnt crest we had discovered beneath the hearth's foundation earlier that day. "Marjorie chose it unknowingly when she fled here, but Lorne recognized the irony, and so he planned to end it all where it had begun." Hildesheer turned now to Lyon. "You were complicit in the beginning," Holmes said gently, "but you tried to undo the damage. You gave her safe passage when others hunted her. You passed fragments to us, but you withheld one detail until the end." Lyon looked away. "The location of the chalice. Indeed, you were afraid," Holmes continued, "afraid that if we found it, we would also find the full extent of what had been done there." Rigby spoke up now. "What was done there?" Holmes drew a breath, then gestured to the ledger. In the final pages of Edwin Ultham's writings, Marjorie transcribed. Something chilling. They cleanse by immersion, not by water, but by forgetting. At the chalice, victims weren't simply murdered. They were drugged, starved, discredited and drowned beneath layers of ritual and silence. Their very histories were buried. He turned back to the room. This is what the Brotherhood truly feared. Not exposure of individual crimes, but exposure of their methodology, of a system designed to erase people without leaving blood. Lorne built a doctrine of disappearance. He stepped over to the photograph, the original image of St. Miriam's personnel. There were 7, Holmes said. 4 are now dead. 2 fled and were never found. But Lorne, he stayed. Not because he was brave, but because he believed. He was invincible. Marjorie spoke again softly. And Greeley? Holmes looked at her. A solicitor who lost his way. Recruited years ago, likely as early as 1899. Used for property concealment, forged deaths and document disposal. He believed he was merely protecting the legal interests of a forgotten charity. Only later did he realize what he was preserving. By then, his hands were too dirty to stop. Toller's voice cracked. But why me? I didn't know anything. You didn't, Holmes said kindly. But your inn became the stage. Lorne needed the innkeeper to be ordinary, familiar. So when strange guests arrived, or Miss Hartwood took ill, No one asked too many questions. You gave him what he wanted without meaning to. Holmes walked to the window, drew back the curtain, and peered into the fog. You see, every piece of this puzzle existed before the crime itself. The disappearance was not the beginning. It was the climax. What we uncovered was not one act of cruelty, but the slow, calculated unspooling of a doctrine that had survived for decades. He let the curtain fall and turned back to us, but it was Marjorie's resistance that broke it. Her memory, her words, her trail. She was never a victim of disappearance. She was the architect of their collapse. Marjorie's hand trembled on the blanket. I didn't think it would work. Holmes approached her gently. It did, because even a shadow must leave a shape when it falls. The room was silent then, and for the first time in days I felt the weight lift, not fully, but enough to allow breath. The mask, the ledger, the names, they had lost their power, because they had been spoken aloud. Holmes sat at last, his shoulders easing. Well, he said softly, that concludes the performance. But not the epilogue, I said. He glanced at me. No, that still waits. In the quiet that followed, the fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a nightingale gave a single cry, and within the walls of the Bluebell Inn, the truth, long buried, long feared, finally had a voice. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The morning after Holmes's revelation dawned, pale and still. For the first time in over a week, the fog had lifted. The road beyond the Bluebell Inn shimmered with dew, and a cautious kind of peace returned to Elcombe. But within the vicarage, where Marjorie Hartwood remained under careful watch, the quiet was less serenity and more suspended breath, an unease that justice, now so close, might yet slip away. I found Holmes standing in the garden behind the inn, the charred remnants of the cellar's secret entrance now sealed with fresh timber. He was smoking, rare for that hour, and watching the horizon with such stillness I dared not interrupt him immediately. "He'll stand trial?" I asked at last. He exhaled slowly. "He will, though not for all his crimes. Because some have no record. Because some," Holmes said grimly, "were designed never to leave a trace. The Brotherhood was meticulous. The victims were not simply silenced, they were erased. Most of the names in Marjorie's ledger are the only record that those people ever existed." He turned toward me. "But the ledger is enough, and Lorne's letter, delivered by his own hand, will serve as the final proof of his guilt. Scotland Yard can weave a case from that. And Greeley, he will likely bargain for leniency, testimony in exchange for years instead of life. And Lyon," Holmes was silent a moment. Then, "his conscience sentenced him long ago. He will not run. I suspect he'll return to his chapel and quietly await whatever judgment finds him." We walked together to the vicarage, where Marjorie sat in the sun-drenched reading room with a shawl about her shoulders, the ledger resting on her lap. She looked stronger. The lines of fear had not disappeared from her face, but they had softened, replaced by a weary kind of defiance. She looked up as Holmes entered. "They say the fog is finally gone." "For now," Holmes said, "but fog always returns. That's its nature." Marjorie gave a faint smile. "And yet it lifted long enough." He nodded, then crouched before her. "The Brotherhood will not return. Whatever shadow they cast is broken. She touched the ledger's cover. They'll never know what they preserved. This book, they thought it was the key to silence, but it was a mirror. Holmes stood. A mirror, yes. And now we've turned it toward the world. As we stepped outside again, Constable Rigby approached, tipping his cap. Scotland Yard's men have arrived, Mr. Holmes. Lawns being transported to London under full escort. Holmes nodded. Has he said anything? Only this. Rigby reached into his pocket and handed Holmes a torn scrap of parchment. Holmes read it silently. One day someone else will wear the mask. You broke the circle, but not the root, I read over his shoulder. A threat? Holmes folded the paper. No, a hope for him. He slipped the note into his coat. But it will remain just that. The brotherhood of the broken tree survives only in the memories of the broken, and in the strength of those who refused to be erased. We returned to the inn later that afternoon to find it quieter than we had ever known it. The guests were gone. The hearth was cold. Mr. Toller had begun removing the scorched wall panels, as if excising rot from a wound. As Holmes collected his belongings from our room, I asked one final question. Did you suspect Lorne from the beginning? No, he said. I suspected the absence of someone, the one not in the room. The silence too perfectly orchestrated. He looked out the window. But it was Marjorie who won this case, Watson. She outwitted them long before I arrived. All I did was follow her breadcrumbs. He picked up the mask from the windowsill. Now, cracked, its red marking faded, and placed it in a box. And this? Holmes closed the lid gently. This stays with me. A reminder that not every villain comes with blood on their hands. Some come with conviction in their hearts. And those, he added softly, are far more dangerous. We left Elcombe just before dusk, the village behind us returning to its rhythm of sheep and chimney smoke, and the quiet passing of seasons. The Bluebell Inn would remain, but its walls would never forget. And neither, I think, would we. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. Several weeks had passed since our return to Baker Street, and though life resumed its familiar rhythms, I found myself haunted by the case in Hampshire. It was not the violence that lingered, though there had been violence enough, nor the strange rites, the hidden rooms, or the fire at the Bluebell Inn. No, what haunted me was the silence of the Brotherhood, the silence of erased names, the silence Holmes had not yet broken. One grey morning, with London in its usual dreary hush, and Holmes deep in study at the chemical bench, I set down my paper and spoke. You've said nothing of the mask since our return. Holmes did not look up. He poured a clear liquid from one vial into another, then set them both down. That is because there is little left to say. But the case, it still lingers with you. He turned now, removing his spectacles. Of course it does, Watson. How could it not? We chased not a man, but an idea. And ideas, when cloaked in piety and fear, rarely die with their authors. He moved to the windowsill, where the box containing the mask still rested. Its surface had dulled. Holmes opened it, studied it a moment, then closed it again with quiet finality. We defeated Emery Lorne, he said, but the brotherhood he created, built on obedience, secrecy, and selective memory, that I fear will resurface in another form, under another name, in another forgotten corner of the world. It always does. But not in Elcombe. No, not there. He turned to me and gestured toward the fire. You recall, Watson, that the final clue, the seal burned in the hearth, contained only a fragment of the letter? I nodded. I took it to my contact at the British Museum. The parchment was older than we thought, mid-Victorian. The ink matched the hand of a former bishop believed to have died in disgrace. Holmes crossed to his desk and removed a second box, smaller, cedar-lined. From it he withdrew a folded sheet of paper, one he had not shared until now. "What does it say?" I asked. He handed it to me. The handwriting was spidery but legible. "The root has been buried. If found, it must not be unearthed. What grows from it cannot be tamed. We sowed silence, and now silence devours us. Pray it remains forgotten." "Someone inside the church tried to stop it," I murmured. Holmes nodded, but failed. And so the Brotherhood passed into private hands, more dangerous, more dogmatic. And when they found men like Lorne to give it form again, it was already too late. He sat in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "It is always the same, Watson. The crime is not the act. It is the system that permits it. And this time we did not just solve a murder. We dismantled the machinery that made such murder invisible." He paused. "But it will take others to keep it from being rebuilt." Sat in silence for a moment longer, the rain beginning to spatter gently against the window pane. Then Holmes said very softly, "Tell her story well." "Marjorie?" "Yes. In your write-up. Let them read the riddle, of course. Let them marvel at the deductions and the escape. But do not forget, she saved herself first. I merely followed her footsteps. I felt a quiet pride then. Pride in her, yes, but also in Holmes, for his humility, for his clarity, for the simple truth he never sought to obscure. "I shall," I said, and I did. That evening I returned to my journal and began to write the case in full, the vanishing from the Bluebell Inn. I detailed the misdirections, the cryptic ledger, the hollow at Briar's Edge, the false priest, the solicitor's betrayal, the burned seal, and the final confrontation in the flooded quarry. But above all, I chronicled the resilience of a woman the world tried to forget, and the brilliance of the man who would not let her be. And in that telling, I hoped, perhaps vainly, that the silence would no longer hold. As I wrote the final line, Holmes looked up from his violin and said almost to himself, "It was never about finding her." I looked up. "No," he smiled faintly. "It was about making sure no one else ever had to vanish that way again." And with that, he drew the bow across the strings, one long low note, and let the shadows of the Bluebell Inn fade into music, into memory, into justice, into history.